Hello, my name's Jesse Hirsch, and I'd like to talk to you today about the farm of the future. I'm a futurist who really works with industry leaders and society to try to anticipate what comes next. Generally speaking, this focuses on technology, but technology just tends to be our focus. It's actually our response to technology, how we use the tools, how we govern them, that really determines our future. But ironically, one of the consequences of being a futurist is I also became a farmer. That as part of my research, both around climate change and technology and artificial intelligence and robotics, I decided that the best way as a futurist to be at the forefront of technology, to be at the forefront of society, was to sell my urban Toronto home and buy a farm. Now, I was lucky enough to do this ahead of the pandemic, but of course, as a first-generation farmer, that means I'm going to have a pretty modest operation. So I have what I call a micro farm, which is essentially an experimental farm that's really designed to look at the forefront of technology. And that really speaks to some of what I'm going to present today, a vision of the future, if you will, that I think could provide you with an opportunity to anticipate where your farming practices is, or if you're not a farmer, where your relationship with your food and your neighbors and how technology may be changing how all of us eat and relate to our food supply. But the other irony, of course, that I want to point out is that, once I became a farmer, I quickly realized, of course, that all farmers are futurists. If you think about it, farmers are kind of the original futurists, because we sort of rely upon them to anticipate the growing season, to anticipate our needs in terms of a society, and we expect them to be both responsible but also innovative in terms of making sure that they make the most of available technology to not only anticipate the future, but actually deliver the crops and livestock that we require as a society to feed ourselves. So if you think about that kind of paradox, right, that farmers are the original futurists, and I kind of came to that realization in a backwards trajectory, well, it also reflects, a second realization I've had, which is the idea that farmers are the original hackers. Now, when I say hacker, obviously I do mean a computer hacker, but I don't mean a criminal. I think it's a mistake that we've synonymized the concept of hacker with that of criminal, because originally computer hackers were just technologically curious. They were just people who took apart their technology to learn how it worked, to learn how to improve it, to find ways in which they can make sure it doesn't break down while also being secure from any hostile attacker. This was the ethos of the hackers at MIT in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s who invented computer programming as we know it. And this is still the kind of esprit de corps of hackers on the internet who have not only brought us everything we take for granted, but protect us on a day-to-day basis from an ongoing pandemic of cyber insecurity. And so it struck me that if we think about our relationship to technology, we think about human civilization and where technology originally came from, well, once again, it's the farmer, right? You think about the origins of human civilization, and it's pretty much agriculture and war as the two kind of drivers of ancient technology. And still today in our contemporary times, it tends to be the military and the agricultural sector who are most incentivized to push the bleeding edge of technology and really try to, in this case, feed the world, right? And get the most amount of gains and productivity out of the broader practice of farming. But we also have to recognize that the farmer themselves, as an individual, embodies that notion of a hacker, right? Of both technologically curious, in terms of someone who wants to understand their tools, understand their farming practices, and understand the technology that might improve their business, that might improve their day-to-day quality of life. But at the same time, the hacker is an independent spirit, right? They're someone who, to as much as possible, wants to be self-sufficient, right? Wants to be prepared for any emergency, any crisis. And in the technology world, there's kind of this saying of hack or be hacked, right? That your level of technological literacy determines whether you can surf the internet safely or, quite frankly, whether the internet surfs you and whether you get taken advantage by the rash of scams and what's the word I'm looking for? The false promises of the information superhighway, who those of us who have been around long enough have recognized that technology often does have empty promises, right? That you're sold a device that's supposed to do one thing when instead it doesn't actually perform that very well. And so that's part of why I'm arguing that farmers are the original hackers, right? The original independent technology tinkerers and inventors who, by necessity, right, if the combine breaks down in harvest season, you do whatever it takes to get it going. And it's that ethos that I think we have to embrace and really hold dear to our heart as we move forward into an advanced agriculture, an automated agriculture, and farms that involve a tremendous amount of technology. Now, this is true really of all sizes of farms, from ones as small as mine to some of the massive farms that we see out in your neck of the woods. But at the same time, there are some fundamental principles, some fundamental values that I think have always been at the core of farming and that we need to maintain and focus on moving forward as we recognize the way in which this technology really enables perhaps a new paradigm of farming, let alone new opportunities for farmers in terms of the way in which they manage their business. Now, perhaps one of the global leaders in this, of course, is John Deere. And John Deere has been at the forefront of autonomous farming, and they've recently revealed their sort of latest generation of autonomous technology. In this case, this is their recent 8R tractor, which is fully autonomous, right? It allows the farmer to literally control the vehicle from their smartphone. And not only does this evoke the potential to deal with labor shortages, the idea of having not just one automated tractor, but a fleet of automated tractors. You know, some of you may have been experiencing this already. You know, Deere has been really quite progressive in adopting this technology. So for the last few years, for example, farmers have been able to almost literally idle in the cab and kind of surf on social media while allowing the auto steer, while allowing the vehicle to be able to function completely and just have the operator sitting there supervising. But now Deere's gone even further. Now they're like, nope, you don't even have to be in the cab anymore. We've completely automated the entire process. And, this is revolutionary for a number of different reasons. Number one, we are dealing with a massive labor shortage in agriculture. It's been difficult to keep young people interested in the sector, but it's also difficult to attract new people to work what can often be really time and labor intensive jobs. So the prospect of automation is quite tantalizing. The idea that you could expand your operations, cover more acreage, and do so with less people because you could literally program your equipment to do its task for you. Now, obviously, this requires a whole lot of trust, right? Both trust that these systems are going to work, trust that the errors or the potential snafus that we all know are a natural part of farming, how those will manifest with these automated systems, we're still kind of finding out. So, we are talking about some brave souls here who are willing to surf the bleeding edge of technology to basically pilot these systems, and I think there's tremendous rewards in doing so. I'm not trying to discourage. I'm only trying to offer a kind of sober assessment of, with more power comes more responsibility. But I think there's a really interesting opportunity here, especially in northern communities where it may be difficult, certainly compared to southern Alberta, to attract the kind of labor, to attract the kind of help that these types of autonomous systems do present, I think, a lot of people with an opportunity to even expand their business, let alone maintain it, without having access to the types of people that are involved. And the general promise that Deere has been offering for years is this notion of precision agriculture. Is this idea that with autonomous systems, we're not only doing away with the need for that labor, but in theory, we're doing away with the potential errors of manual labor, the imprecision of, a blanket spraying rather than spot spraying. And of course, this has been going on for a number of years now, but to close the loop on automation is a significant milestone. And I think Deere deserves kudos for, being one of the first major manufacturers to really embrace autonomous systems at scale. And this is a pretty major accomplishment, right? To see these types of vehicles, operating entirely via remote control, via programming, so that you could pre-program what you want done on a field using the data that these systems have gathered for it. I think that is incredible, and it does represent a really a new paradigm when we think about what's possible in terms of the profitability and the sustainability of farming operations. But of course, there is still some controversy that comes with the way in which our heavy equipment is being automated. I mean, there are many who have noted that contemporary tractors and combines are arguably more computers than they are heavy equipment. And I say this in the sense that it is impossible to operate this machinery without the software being functional. And if something goes wrong, and it's often not just a mechanical issue, because, this is the whole drive-by-wire approach in which there isn't an actual mechanical function anymore. Software controls even the mechanical aspects of these machines. So when something goes wrong, the farmer's no longer in a position to fix it themselves. And this is where the right to repair movement has been certainly in Europe, in the United States, as well as modestly so here in Canada, a bit of a growing concern. And it's really just trying to create a level playing field. Both for independent mechanics. I know I rely upon a local tractor mechanic here who has basically now specialized in older machinery because they're no longer able to basically service some of the more contemporary computerized machines. But even if, especially if you're in northern Alberta, you may have different perspectives on the responsiveness of whether the authorized technician is going to come and be able to diagnose and fix your computer on the weekend or in a crunch in terms of harvest or planting when everyone else is encountering those same errors. And that's where the right to repair is sort of an ongoing call to whether it's from a legislative perspective or as recently in January of this year, there was a class action lawsuit, which is basically imploring that John Deere sort of create either some capacity for the farmer to interact with this software themselves or allow independent mechanics to be able to access this software, or conversely, that the same way that you have a desktop computer, you could install Windows, you could install an old version of Windows, you could install Linux. The idea is that if you own the hardware, you should be able to install whatever you want on that machine. So what if instead of John Deere just providing the hardware, what if there were third parties who specialized in software that operated John Deere machines? And I actually think that has a tremendous amount of potential when you think about the goodwill that John Deere has. And I think this is a liability for them, that to maintain control of the software supply chain rather than allow an ecosystem of providers is kind of short-sighted. And I think really fundamentally that's where the idea of a kind of right to repair movement doesn't so much reflect how I'm arguing that farmers need to be hackers, but rather that we need a diverse ecosystem of add-ons, of what the farming economy has always possessed, which is the ability to allow people to modify their equipment and then sell those modifications back to the marketplace. Because the real irony here is, John Deere may be at the forefront of creating automated tractors, but let's spend a few moments talking about robots and agricultural robots, because this is an example of NIO, which is one of the world's leading agricultural robotics company. They're a French company, and France happens to have a cluster of agriculture robotics companies producing robots that, as you can see here, look nothing like tractors, right? Look nothing like combines. And they sort of argue that if you're going to use technology on the farm, why not explore the concept from a completely different perspective? And it both suggests the idea that rather than have one tractor or one combine, which of course large operations don't, they have many. Well, what if you had a fleet of robots? What if these robots were small and nimble to avoid soil compaction, were fast, and were modular, so they were able to do all sorts of different functions throughout the growing season, and enabling a new kind of soil management, right? Especially when it comes to looking at different ways in which you can maximize yield and minimize the costs that you have in terms of inputs. Because where NIO, as a French company, their robots still sort of resemble the functionalities that would come from a tractor. This is a company called Small Robot Company, and they're based out of Britain, and they're producing robots that are radically different. And these are meant to be robots that allow what they call per plant agriculture. So this is taking precision agriculture to a level of specificity in which you're analyzing and understanding every single living thing within your acreage. And what's interesting about them is, like NIO, these are people who are presenting a post-pesticide version of farming. So this is an instance in which you're manually de-weeding, right? These guys use lasers or a little heat to actually kill any of the unauthorized vegetation. NIO was using blades, so they use just basically a little hoe to automatically cut out the vegetation. But all of these companies, partly in response to the European market, are developing technology that radically reduces inputs. Which, if you think about current supply chain issues, there's other reasons why you might be wanting to reduce your inputs. And what's interesting here is the way in which this technology gathers information on this per plant basis. The way it's literally analyzing and cataloging every square centimeter of a field that then allows for greater applications moving forward. And I'll come back in a little bit to why this level of granular data is significant and precedent setting. But I also want to point out that these robots are really starting to get into a random level of capabilities, both in terms of small intensive farms, but even at scale, even if you're talking about farms of tens of thousands of acres, I would still argue that it's cheaper to have fleets of these tiny robots maintaining those tens of thousands of acres than it would to be invest in $1 million machines, of which you still need multiple $1 million machines to be able to handle currently that size of acreage. So that's why I say I think that we are looking at a potential radical shift in terms of your operating costs as a business, which is why I think these robots have tremendous potential. Finally, I also wanted to give this example of pixel farming robotics, because this is a different style of robot, in part because the solar panels on this robot really make it energy efficient, right? And allow it to operate, especially when you think about the hours of daylight you guys get in northern Alberta in the summer. These are the types of robots that, again, allow for remarkable scale and are incredibly modular in terms of the capabilities that you can install under those solar panels to tend to the crops underneath. And, I've showcased 3 different companies amongst dozens that are developing these types of robots. Some of these are backed by venture capital. Some of these are backed by state capital, as I mentioned, in terms of the government of France. And others are crowdsourced. And because they're crowdsourced, because they have farmers who have already committed to buying them and financing them, they will be viable. It's a question of what scale. And so it's interesting to see a diverging model between the kind of John Deere vision, which is we're going to take our traditional heavy equipment and just automate it, versus these guys who are saying, let's reimagine agricultural machinery from the bottom up so that we can not only take advantage of the revolution in robotics, but just have smaller, cheaper, more nimble machines that make it easy both to allow smaller operators to afford this kind of technology, but scale it up in a way that I think allows for much larger operators to radically reduce their overhead in terms of both the inputs that they're using and the machinery that they're using to manage their land. Now, of course, I was told that not everyone here at the conference, works in agriculture. And I wanted to give an example of automated grain carts, because that is another interesting area right now in agriculture. But why give a grain cart example when, there's all sorts of examples? So Volvo, for example, they've been investing quite aggressively, like John Deere, in automating heavy equipment. And they've got an interesting range of autonomous technology. In this case, relatively small, but you could imagine the way in which this applies both to mining and oil exploration in northern Alberta, but like road maintenance, quarries, right? There's all sorts of ways in which this technology has tremendous opportunity. And, it's not just in terms of the haulage, it's also in terms of the digging and the loading. I mean, when you start looking at the way in which automation and heavy equipment are sort of dovetailing with electric vehicles, I mean, I'm focusing today on agriculture, but this suggests that this revolution is really dealing in a wide range of industries that not only changes the labor dynamics of how this works, but I think it also changes the dynamics of remote locations and the way in which we access those remote locations. Because, these are autonomous systems. There's also a lot of interesting stuff that's been going on in terms of remote controlled work. Again, Volvo's been getting a lot of the press for it, but there's, a lot of small companies as well who are doing this kind of experimentation. I've been seeing a lot of it on TikTok that I think has tremendous potential. Most of what I've been sort of demonstrating today are autonomous systems, but remote control systems are just as relevant, right? Like, imagine the same way that I'm sitting in a studio right now. Imagine the farmer sitting in a studio and they're monitoring a dozen different machines. And they don't trust those machines sufficiently enough for them to be fully autonomous, but they can leverage the autonomy just like you'd have cruise control on the highway. The farmer becomes a fleet operator who sort of sits there in front of a bank of monitors, as this picture on the side here, and just supervises the farm equipment to make sure that none of it breaks down, right? Or maybe they've hired an operator and it's that operator's job to work all those different machines. And I partly say this from my own experience because, as a newcomer to farming, of course, what I quickly learned is that most farmers in Eastern Ontario have day jobs, right? Most of the farms here are small and the economics of farming are really difficult. So, of course, I'm interested in a similar kind of, a similar kind of surveillance, which is to say I've set up remote cameras across my farm. And these cameras sort of make it easy for me to pay attention to my animals and pay attention to my land while I'm doing my work. And, what's interesting, and I suspect a lot of you have done this yourselves, right? You've set up different kinds of surveillance, and different ways in which you can keep a tab from a security perspective. But it's actually not that difficult to deploy these systems across your property, right? And, be able to watch your barn, be able to watch your animals. And I say this primarily because I find that our animals behave differently when we're around and we're not around. So it's easier for us to monitor their health. It's easier for us to monitor, how the kids are doing, how the newborns are doing. And similarly, it's also really easy for me to redeploy these cameras when I need them, right? And be able to monitor them. So I'm almost anticipating as I start deploying robots that one of the ways in which I will be deploying those robots, will be sort of, anticipating a kind of command and control center and anticipating the way in which, the data that I collect on my farm really sort of focuses my operations. And this is where I'm going to, take a moment to kind of give a bit of a kind of commercial message to our sponsor. Farm Credit Canada, to give them credit, they recognize the value of data in the contemporary agricultural operations. Because, we take for granted how essential data is in building all these autonomous systems. And I think farmers take for granted the reality that their data is a potential cash crop. That if you think of all the commodities that you are creating, that you're raising, that you're manufacturing on your farm, are you valuing the data that you are collecting, whether through your livestock, whether through your crops, or increasingly, whether through your equipment and your machinery? By default, most of that data is going to some company without you being in a position to manage that data. Now, this is part of the consulting that I do for farmers in terms of helping them understand a strategic approach to their technology and the commodities that they're creating. For example, my farm generates a few $100s a month live streaming our animals because there are people on the internet who like to look at baby goats. So that's one example in which I'm monetizing the data that I am creating, in this case, video data. But there's a wide range of data that you have on your farm. And FCC has created software in terms of Ag Expert Field, but also their accounting software that sort of helps you develop this data building capacity. And I hope that as time moves forward, FCC will be expanding their offerings to farmers so that they can help understand the capabilities and necessities that farmers have when it comes to organizing and managing their data. And look, quite frankly, a very tangible example of this is the blockchain, right? So the blockchain is really a revolution in database technology. You may have heard of cryptocurrency, of Bitcoin, and lately there's things called NFTs, or non-fungible tokens. We won't even get into that. But from a technology perspective, the blockchain represents an upgrade of database technology as we know it. Partly because we live in a data-driven society. So if you think about, say, data in agriculture, there's a growing range of ways in which the data you are collecting, and again, you may not even be aware of the data you're collecting. It might be being collected on your behalf without your knowledge. But that data is going to play an increasingly important role in the way in which you interact with the marketplace as a whole. The obvious example of this is, of course, traceability in terms of consumers, but also the people who are buying your products wanting to know how you grew them or how you raised those animals, right? What kinds of medicines, what kinds of fertilizer, what kinds of inputs that you used. Increasingly, this type of information will be mandatory. It already is with contract farmers, and I suspect it will increasingly be that way with farmers who are selling to major buyers, but even to the marketplace as a whole. And blockchain kind of provides the technology for the data sharing that enables that to take place. And there's pilot projects across the agricultural sector that have been proving this kind of concept. I'll share a few of you in a moment, but I just wanted to emphasize how important it is to not only recognize that you're creating data right now in your basic agricultural operations, but also how that data could be used against you, right? That data could be used to suggest that your practices are not as they should be, are not perhaps evolving with people's expectations. And that's where I think it's important to have that literacy, to recognize that data is a kind of double-edged sword. That on the one hand, it enables much more efficient, much more profitable, much more capable precision agriculture, but it also imposes transparency. It also potentially forces people to know more about your agricultural practices. So I think it's important to understand that moving forward, that we recognize the potential prices that you could get for your products could be influenced by the data that you've collected about how those products were made. Many farmers have already clued into this, but there are many others who are still understanding how the way in which a data-driven marketplace is very much going to impose different values and standards upon how we think of agriculture as a whole. So just to share a few sort of examples of blockchain startups. This is one called Ripe.io. That's sort of building a system that allows for different information sharing. You know, again, I'm pretty sure these guys are looking at fruit, hence the Ripe.io. But no, they're also looking at pork. Pork is another one that other industries have looked at. You know, AgriDigital is a wheat-based, pretty sure, yeah, grain in Australia. And now here's an interesting other example that kind of speaks to where this stuff is heading. Ether Risk is an insurance application. So, you know, the first examples I gave, Ripe.io and AgriDigital, these are traceability applications. But Ether Risk is offering crop insurance. And so this is peer-to-peer crop insurance. They're focusing initially on Africa, but this is the idea that instead of turning to a major underwriter for your crop insurance, you'll turn to random people on the internet who, for a reasonable rate of return, might give you a cheaper price on your insurance and might give you a better payout when it comes time to collect. And so this is the world of smart contracts. When we think about the way in which a blockchain technology harnesses agricultural data, and in this case uses that agricultural data to then create insurance contracts outside of the traditional insurance industry. And for the record, I am not endorsing this. I don't recommend it. I'm just identifying it as a trend when it comes to the future of this industry. But here's an even crazier development. It's what are called DAOs, or Distributed Autonomous Organizations. And here I'll explain this very briefly, and then I'll give you an example. Blockchain enthusiasts are automating corporations. They're deciding, well, Jesse, if you can automate a tractor, well, then why can't you automate an entire corporation? Now, this is an example, Syndicate.io, which are creating automated corporations that are investing clubs. So they're basically corporations whose sole purpose is to engage in market speculation, right? To buy and sell cryptocurrencies, but to automate it. But here's my prediction. The commodities markets are rapidly going to be automated by blockchain-based entities called Daos, Distributed Autonomous Organizations, which are going to attempt to either corner commodities markets or manipulate commodities markets for their own benefit. And so let's take inputs, for example. Right now, there's a supply chain shortage. And the larger manufacturers, due to their size, are able to have, let's say, greater agency in the market than independent operators just because of their scale and their infrastructure. Well, what if those independent operators were to use software to organize themselves into an automated cooperative that bought up all those supplies or the raw materials to make those supplies and then sold it back to the manufacturers, aka the suppliers, at a markup? Now, this is what's currently happening in capital markets right now as automated trading, well, let's just say it kind of runs capital markets into a bit of a frenzy. But I'm predicting that that's going to happen with commodities markets, if it's not happening already, again, due to similar automated tools. So I encourage you, as an entrepreneur, to take a few moments to start researching what a DAO is. A DAO, or Distributed Autonomous Organization, because I can assure you they're pretty wild. And they offer a really interesting example of the potential of social media, the potential of automation when it comes to the way in which people organize. Now, all of this sort of gets into the larger notion of what happens when we organize our data. And a lot of people ask, hey, Jesse, is this cryptocurrency stuff a scam? Or is it the future of society's infrastructure? And my answer to that is generally yes. Because the problem here is that it's both, right? On the one hand, blockchain, without a doubt, is the future of database technology. It's the future in which you can organize the data from your farm, share that data with your partners, with your customers, with your suppliers, and do so securely. But because the government, because industry has been slower than the technology, a lot of scammers, a lot of fraudsters have taken advantage of that regulatory lag. And so as a result, it's a bit of a predatory prey environment. Unfortunately, that leaves farmers in a bit of a pickle because technology is driving the world forward. And as farmers, whether you like it or not, you are still at the forefront of technology. And so that's where this notion of the farmer as hacker is so essential. Because for many people, you're not going to have the privilege to sort of stand back and wait for the dust to settle and figure out which technology you want to use to market your products. Now, that's where a few moments ago I sort of used the word social media in the context of a distributed autonomous organization. Now, when I used to give this talk 3 or 4 years ago, I used to talk a lot about why farmers need to embrace social media, whether it's for purposes of marketing or as purposes of education. But I don't need to emphasize that anymore because almost all the farmers I know are social media experts, right? And it's partly because of, auto steer that they already had a lot of free time sitting in the cab. So, hey, why not go on Twitter and, chat with folks? Why not go on Instagram? Why not go on TikTok? And I mean, TikTok is my current favorite only because I find the algorithm is far more accurate. So both farm TikTok and heavy machinery TikTok is, I find, an infinite source of knowledge and education that really helps me understand both the future of agriculture, but also any problem I might have, right? This is the irony that as a novice farmer, as someone who only 5 years ago was a city idiot, any problem I encounter with my tractor, any problem that I encounter in general, I can go to YouTube, I can go to TikTok, and another farmer has already shared their knowledge of how to resolve that problem. And that kind of peer-to-peer education is the engine of innovation, right? It is what's driving this revolution in technology. And I sometimes wonder if farmers take that for granted, because they've been doing it forever, right? Before there was social media, there was neighbors, right? There was co-ops. There was ways in which that knowledge was shared and mobilized. But that's where I'm going to be the idiot in the room and bring it back to, hey guys, you're hackers. You're futurists. You're at the forefront of technology, and you should take some pride in that. But with great power comes great responsibility. And our society's kind of confused by technology. We're overwhelmed by technology. In fact, if you went to most people and you said to them, "Are you hacking or are you being hacked?" most of them would feel like they're being hacked. So that's where I kind of want to end with a challenge, with a sort of provocation in which I want to challenge all of you to embrace the idea that as a farmer, you're a hacker, you're a futurist, and it's your job to figure out technology on behalf of society, to help us make sense of how all this stuff works and figure out what we should use and not use. Because what I'm arguing here today is that our most advanced technology, artificial intelligence, robotics, blockchain, social media, it's all stuff that farmers are going to become dependent upon, are going to need to master and have advanced literacy on in order to make sure you maintain your profitability and prosperity. But the consequence of taking up my challenge and learning about this technology, specifically as it applies to your operations, is you're also going to gain the literacy that the rest of society requires. So in the spirit of each one teach one, you could teach yourself about agricultural technology and then turn around and teach the rest of us what you're learning so that we as a society can explore this technology through the lens of food production, but also in a way to understand when and where blockchain can be used responsibly, how automation can actually give us a better society with a greater quality of life, and how technology as a whole can be used in a way to empower people rather than make them afraid, rather than make them fear some type of dystopian future, when instead it can actually help us to feed the world. So I hope, if anything, I've kind of inspired or provoked you to recognize that hackers aren't criminals, that, farmers are the original futurists. And there's actually a lot of opportunities for us to use technology in really interesting ways to not only transform agriculture, but transform society as a whole. So I apologize that I wasn't able to make it to Northern Alberta. I'd love to spend time in the Peace River Valley and explore some of your farms. I mean, I've spent lots of time in Edmonton, and I've certainly made it up to Yellowknife. So please add me on Twitter, connect with social media. I'd love to learn more about what you do. So perhaps in the future, I can have an opportunity to come up and visit with y'all and learn more about the unique challenges and the beauties of farming where you live. Thanks and take care.